So, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to the OECD and to the organizers. You've done an impeccable job in really organizing a fascinating seminar today. Also, thank you to Javier for introducing that complexity of the question of the digital economy and trade and the challenges that we have ahead. First, when I look at Javier's slides, I thought, well, he's already done my job. I'd rather not even take the floor. But I think that we would have some complementarity, and I'm going to try to focus on that. So let me start by trying to recap where we are. We have said this morning, and it's been very eloquently put, that we're living now at the break of a new era. And I want to emphasize that. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We're not there yet. We're just at the dawn of that transformation of societies that is going to come with it. We're actually living, for the moment, in that pre-stage, if you like, where information has already very much shaped the way in which we produce, in which we trade, but also our lives. But we continue to go somewhere in between the 20th century and a sort of 21st century economy. We live in this hybrid world. And we know from previous revolutions, and this morning Jim Lee was very clear on that as well, that they challenge not only societies as they revolutionize again all the economics, but also the state, international cooperation, and society. They also challenge governance. And so when the water and steam powered and eventually electricity revolutionized production, that placed challenges that had to do with how to minimize adverse impacts on the poor, the question of negative spillovers of domestic policies on other countries in what became already then a rapidly globalized economy. And from the policy perspective, which is where I focus, we're still trying to catch up with what that means. We don't have yet the frameworks in place that would perfectly help us govern over that third revolution, if you like. So we're now going into a fourth revolution, and again, entrepreneurship, technological development have taken the fast track. Governance is trying to catch up, as Javier just explained, and this morning Chiara, we at the domestic level, as well as in governance of the interdependence of economies in these globalized markets, are just scrambling to try to understand what is it that is necessary. We keep hearing, and this is very interesting, in the morning, a call for governments to do something. And that call, again, comes probably from the experiences that we're going through and the perils that we see that come with the new opportunities that are opened by technologies. So the issues are just getting understood. The forums for international cooperation are terribly unclear. On the question of trade and the digital economy, we really don't know whether the infrastructure that we have, for example, at the multilateral level, is adequate, or whether we should think about setting up a different type of infrastructure. And I'll come back to this. But there must be a reason why the dialogue, the conversation that we're having here is really not yet happening at the level of depth and comprehensively as it should in the fora that we have. So let me move very quickly into a presentation in which I hope I can tell you quickly what we're doing, what we've learned in the past 6-7 years on trying to scrutinize many of these issues, particularly from a development perspective. Look at some of the questions again that already Javier and others have gone through, but with a different lens. So which technologies are we really talking about here? And we mentioned this morning, we're now talking about technologies that are characterized particularly by the processing of data. We're talking about very sophisticated pieces of technology that refer to artificial intelligence, algorithms that analyze data and use them creatively to solve problems, including in robotics. We're talking about something that we're just starting to understand, which is this Internet of Things, where everything will be connected to everything. And as it was mentioned this morning, the number of transactions is just going to scale up in a phenomenal way that, again, we don't yet, we're not yet able to grasp what the consequences of that would be. We're talking about technologies like blockchain and distributed ledger technologies that emerged very recently and are already taking over not only commercial uses, but very rapidly on governance, including the definition of identities, the traceability of products, what is called smart contracts that could actually atomize and operate, for instance, compliance with trade rules, related, for instance, to rules of origin or to standards. So that is already happening. In my country, coffee growers are using blockchain technologies to ensure, again, traceability of their products so that through geographical indications and so on, they could they could increase their gains in markets. So all this is already transformational, and we don't yet know what's the extent of the strategic applications of all these technologies. What we have done has helped us come up with different ways of categorizing the technologies, trying to understand the phenomenon of online platforms, for instance, from the perspective of trade, and how to deal then with the rules on all these technologies. But again, as I mentioned before, the speed of development is much bigger than we can really cope with. E-commerce itself, in the most simple definition of e-commerce, represents in 2016 $25.7 trillion in value. And as you see here in this graph, which just goes about 10 years, you can see what the internet penetration and the mobile cellular telephone penetration has been, again, and the scale, or rather the pace of growth, which is quite impressive. So for economic development, there are a number of questions that are raised that we still are also trying to understand. Let me start there before I go to trade very quickly. Declining prices of information and communication technologies and popularization of the technologies encouraging investment and lead to this digital transformation. The expansion of connectivity, infrastructure, network effects, falling computer and sensor cost, open software architectures, that the regulation of digital markets are all enabling the emergence of a whole new generation of investment and business models. But how do they relate to development? This morning, Chiara particularly tackled a very difficult question yet, which is the issue of productivity and competitiveness. So promoting productivity by exposing the firms to new ideas, as we heard about it this morning, to research, to technology, best operating and management practices, and by creating new channels of access to global markets while helping to reduce cost, is something that seems obvious at sort of first sight. Optimizing the process of production, reducing transaction costs, transforming supply chains, promoting trade facilitation, again, should then increase competitiveness. So you have gains in productivity and gains in competitiveness that are immediately expected from these technologies. And this should enable firms to participate then in global value chains, is what we all immediately think about, and directly access customers in foreign markets in ways that are previously were only feasible for large and established companies from advanced economies. So we have done a great deal of work looking at countries, for instance, in Africa, looking at micro and small medium enterprises, and also looking at individuals and those that are traditionally more disadvantaged, say, for instance, women in LDCs. And we now have data sets that will tell you that some of this is true, but the scale of it remains terribly modest. So we get excited about the little blips that we see and try to understand then what should be, both at the domestic and the international level, the kind of frameworks that should enable a rapid scale-up of this phenomenon. So let me just summarize in a way that the first instinct that we have with digital technologies, and I agree with that, I'm just saying that we need much more nuanced understanding, is that it is of great benefit and a great promise to development. The question is, how do we realize that promise? How do we realize the potential of those digital economies? How do we, for instance, ensure that there is actually leapfrogging that allow firms in emerging economies and in poorer countries to explore new frontiers of economic development, optimize economic potential, and in a way seize what should be the last opportunity for catch-up and convergence. And there's a lot in the literature, again, that promises, but we don't yet find what should be the regulatory frameworks to make sure that this happens. Just on the question of the digital divide, and I'll come back to that, we continue to live in a world where here in Korea, we heard this morning, if I remember well, with my jet lag, 98% of Koreans have access to internet and use mobile technologies. But 4 billion people out there in the rest of the world don't have it. And so that gives you an extent of that divide. The divide is also even more critical when you look at the numbers of those that do have access. And then you find that the quality of the access is terribly heterogeneous. So while you here are already experimenting with 5G, many countries are still in the first generation of mobile technologies, which means that all these marvels that we heard about are not accessible to them. So they may have the basic infrastructure for digital technologies, but they cannot really take advantage of the opportunities that we're talking about yet. So while the dissemination of digital technologies is highly valuable for productivity and the creation of wealth, I think that it's very important that we keep in mind the limits that are also caused by what economists, and I'm thinking about Jorge Abache, for instance, in Brazil, have been looking into, and that they call the digital commoditization. So to simplify, as technologies become cheaper and popularized, they stop being a factor of productivity that allows also leaps in competitiveness and become rather a condition to participate in markets. So you are sort of a step behind and remain there if all you do is use and adopt the technologies. And this is particularly important in international trade. International trade and e-commerce, just to limit ourselves to that, is very much based on this technology of platforms. Those that develop the technology for the platforms, manage those platforms, own the platforms, distribute, those have an advantage that leads to the kind of world that Jun Lee was talking about this morning of the winner takes all in a very fast fashion. But also, they very dramatically leave behind those others that don't have the ability to go beyond the adoption and the use of the technologies. And so again, this is what Kara was talking about this morning. You need all these capabilities, first to allow for the adoption and the use, but you need even much larger capabilities that involve structural issues in institutions, in economic development, in policies, in order to jump from the user, the adopter, to the developer and the manager of technologies. I'm neglecting my slides, but so that's one point that I wanted to leave with you before we move forward. Let me see if I can run faster here. So, and think about when Javier talked about the global economy, think about what is happening today. Those factors that in Cambodia or in Bangladesh have traditionally played their competitive advantage on low labor cost are now competing with automation in the US, right? So it's the case of Adidas or several other cases that we're now seeing in the making, where the cost to produce a t-shirt, for instance, or a pair of sneakers goes down to 30 cents or below of $1, which is something that is really unviable in terms of competition, even with low labor costs. And so you have the reshoring, and that's what I'm talking about. Then there are the opportunities, of course. So when a German startup company, for instance, wishes to hire the cheaper services of a website designer than those that they can hire in the German market, they go to a platform called Fever, and they find bidding offers for those services from Philippines or from Nigeria or from South Africa. And so they can seize also those opportunities. And that means, again, that we are in a world that is just reconfiguring its competitive advantages in a major way. So taking a clear look at the application of those technologies, really, what does it all mean from a trade and development perspective? So from a trade perspective, we've talked about a potential for significant trade cost reduction. For example, the question of machine translation in imports and exports, which is the latest sort of huge change that we've had in technology in the past few months, where a phenomenon where the EU and the UN and institutions that have been doing bulk massive translation of documents to a number of languages made all this data available so that companies now can use it to set up through artificial intelligence what is really revolutionary ability of machines to translate between languages. Language is a barrier to trade that we usually underestimate and under-research. And so we estimate that from that machine translation phenomenon, we will probably have an incredible revolution in many ways, particularly as we move into an economy that is global economy that is heavily characterized by services. So we're looking at some preliminary cost estimations of these kind of effects. We see that about 60% of firms that are able to use or rather that firms that are already able to use some of these services quote up to 16% of savings. And so again, this is just beginning. There are also efficiency gains. For example, again, the blockchain managed global value chains facilitating the flow of information from countrysides to the capital to the importer. The new technologies can replace jobs, offset accidents through human enhancement technologies. Again, we don't know what this means in terms of capabilities, but we know that there will be new opportunities and lower production costs. And then there's this question of the democratization of the participation in trade and the fostering of economic development that I talk about when digitally enabled technologies are made available to everyone, and they can offer opportunities then for those that have traditionally been either marginalized or completely out of global markets. So informal sector, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, and from a perspective of equity, women. Let me try to move a bit quickly in my notes. But one of the perils, and I know that I'm trying to balance both sort of risks and opportunities, have to do with the question of whether new technologies may further boost a return to the highly educated, well-connected, with emotional intelligence and creativity to complement the robots, to reinforcing in this way patterns of privilege among individuals in societies. There's also, obviously, the questions related to competition that we've mentioned before. In the digital transformation, economies of scale are extreme as the marginal cost of serving additional customers fall to effectively zero, and quality advantages can lead to near of total market dominance. And we don't have yet the frameworks to address these questions, not in the domestic market, and certainly, well, with the exception perhaps of some few cases and obviously institutions and law in the European context, we also don't have it at the global level. They're first movers that try to take the driver's seats by engaging in the standard setting as well. And again, we talked about the standards this morning. They work at an early stage by de facto defining those standards, while new forms of bias then are embedded in algorithms, for instance, and they kick in a way that they lock those standards and others out of the possibility of competition. So that question of standards is particularly important. We look at it this morning. Countries have different standards that can facilitate or block digitally enhanced trade. When it comes to trade, this includes regulations related to encryption, to product safety certification, to product screening, to testing requirements, to electronic authentication and signatures, and rules for electronic payment platforms. On blockchain, different digital platforms for the management of blockchain are emerging and starting to gain market share, again in ways that would block others than the first movers out of specific niches of markets. So multilateral policy making could potentially help coordinate the governance of these platforms, and perhaps even the platforms themselves, some have suggested, through which digital transactions are accepted in international markets as valid evidence of a trade contract, for instance. Regional trade agreements are the laboratory where we're experimenting with new rules for this digital economy and the digitally enabled trade. And we see some convergence, particularly from the e-commerce related perspective. For instance, we see rules on the elimination of customs duties on electronic transmissions, consumer protection, authentication methods and e-signatures, and paperless trading that can be found in half or more of some 69 RTAs that Mark Wu from Harvard Law School has looked into for one of our projects at ICTSD. This includes also standalone e-commerce chapters of provisions notified to the WTO between 2001 and 2007. In contrast, rules on data localization, on cross-border data flows, and on source code are rather scarce. There's some soft law rather than hard disciplines, although in the language of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that CTPPP, that Korea is a member of, this remains the most advanced binding provisions that we have on cross-border data flows in a preferential context. It provides 3 binding obligations, namely a prohibition to impose computing facility localization requirements, an obligation to allow the cross-border transfer of information, and a prohibition to require the transfer of or access to source code owned by a person of another party. The question of cross-data in cross-border cooperation in data regulation is particularly critical. Well, this table you have seen, I think, in the slides that Javier presented as well, but it gives you just an idea of RTAs and the opportunities for convergence here. But I was talking about cross-border cooperation in data regulation. There is, with this question, the difficulty of separating privacy, security, and safety on one hand from the commercial aspects of cross-border data. And so countries find themselves in very different approaches to how to do it. The US and the EU shared a broadly similar vision about data flows. They have agreed to what is called the EU-US Trade Principles for Information and Communication Technology Services, agreeing on open networks, use on a technology-neutral basis, free flow of information internally and across borders, no requirement for information communication technology service suppliers to use local infrastructure or to establish a local presence as a condition of supplying services, and competitive access to markets in authorization and licenses. The EU, however, is silent on data localization, emphasizes privacy, as is, for instance, reflected in the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the CETA. Other countries have requirements to store data within a particular jurisdiction or locate computing facilities locally, and that's something that is changing almost every week in countries around the world. For example, on internet governance, China's main legislation is the cybersecurity law, which came into effect on the 1st June of 2017, essentially setting 3 major rules: mandatory storage of physical data in mainland China, mandatory security inspections of equipment before installation, and mandatory law enforcement assistance on data retention and regulations. It's a guess whether this kind of regulation, for instance, on the question of localization, is something that could be dealt with technology itself. So the efficiencies that are lost in the networks and the data transmissions, can they be offset through technological fixes? I asked this question, I had the opportunity to do that in March at a forum, a small roundtable with Tim Cook and Jack Ma and the regulatory authority in China. And the response was mixed. Some think that, well, this is an issue where market size will probably determine what's the inclination of countries to regulate. But one thing would be dealing with maybe a handful, maybe a dozen markets with localization requirements. Something else, from a technological perspective too, will be moving into a world of 100 or 150 different localization requirements, regulation. In an extreme case, we could also imagine that in some markets we would probably see an outright ban on cross-border data flows or of types of cross-border data flows. So it is clear that we need multilateral cooperation to secure the flow of data, complemented by privacy issues, by safety, and by security concerns. That's something that cannot be left aside. The next question, and I won't go too long into this because I see that I'm taking too much time, it's with respect to taxation. And this is sort of the border, the frontier issue, if you like, at this point. And taxation as a means to offset, again, competitive fears. So again, in a small round table with the largest retailers in Europe and the US a few months ago, that was the fear that was expressed on the whole digital economy immediately. So whether the Corte Inglés in Spain or the large Belgian supermarket and owners of 7-Up and so on in the world can compete with the Amazons and the Alibabas. And the response that the business community gives you immediately, almost as a reflection, is tax. Find a way to tax either in the domestic market or at the border these guys, because we need to make sure that, say, the company that, so this is a real case, manages retailing in most of the Middle East. The agreements that they have with Nike, how are they going to be maintained when people start importing through Alibaba and using Alipay? And so it's taxation the response, and that's a very difficult issue. Here in Korea, you have people that are looking at this closely and have good responses to the way this can be done. It obviously depends whether companies are operating only from beyond borders, whether they would be required to establish subsidiaries in the countries in which they operate in each of the markets. So again, the question of taxation, as we start looking into it, and this is changing almost again on a weekly basis around the world, is going to determine to a great extent whether we continue to live in the same type of digitalized economy that we have today or not. Very quickly moving to the frameworks, and let me try to see if I can move quickly through these frameworks. So e-commerce, in the way that it operates today, did not exist during the path of multilateral negotiations that led to the creation of the WTO, the 1992-1993 process of the definitions of subjects for negotiations. This morning, I was talking to the OECD deputy director about the creative and collective effort of conceiving the GATS rules in the WTO during the Uruguay round. And at that time, we were far, and I was a negotiator of services, and my ambassador was the chair, we were far from imagining the kind of world in which we live today and the way in which this digital technology would revolutionize services. However, as Javier pointed out, that framework on trading services contains a great deal that can be used to govern over digital technologies. So there is a system of covered agreements under the current multilateral trade organization that may help, but may not be fully equipped to deal with disruption and the risk evolution of these technologies. In response to this, the latest sort of developments that we have, not to go through the whole history, is the setup in Buenos Aires in 2017 of a plurilateral group that it's exploring ways to bring, to update and bring new disciplines to e-commerce in the WTO. This is on top of this working group that was set up in '96 and '97. It's also on top of a moratorium on transactions, on electronic transactions, which has been in place now for over 15 years. But again, with the new disruptive technologies of the past couple of years, 2-3 years, we're now seeing a challenge to these efforts, including that moratorium on the taxing of electronic transactions. And so this is why it's so important that they're now, members are now looking at what to do. Very quickly going through this, what are the possibilities? One is a services-only approach, but again, as Javier pointed out, that's of limited scope. It doesn't cover the full extent of the e-commerce related value chains. It doesn't resolve the question of whether we're dealing with our goods or services, or whether services that transform into goods. A comprehensive approach, it's a good possibility. It requires a much better understanding of the various elements. So again, countries are just going through a collective exercise of trying to understand where we are. Or what some people call a services plus one approach. So an enhanced coverage of value chains, an enhanced coherence, interoperability of regulatory frameworks, and value of implementation of new trade rules, which would then use the existing rules to move into new rules. I'll try to close here because I see that, again, the time is going very fast. But so the question of how to deal with the complexities of economic development and the digital economy and trade are many. They need to be addressed in building a development dimension into digital trade rules. Perhaps how to do it, use sort of conventional approaches of special and differential treatment. There is this new approach in the 2013 Agreement on Trade Facilitation, which brings on-ramps or enabling possibilities through assistance and technical cooperation, and the definition of countries' own ability to meet the rules, which is something that countries are exploring. The G20 is a very good platform to try to move these things. It's meeting in a couple of weeks. We have been doing work specifically in that context. It has been providing in a periodical, systematic manner some guidance on the hardest issues. And for the first time, the Japanese presidency that is taking over the G20 in December has now scheduled a joint meeting of trade and digital ministers to take place in the spring. Something again that we had been suggesting that is a way to bring coherence to some of these issues, and so we're very much looking forward to participating in that and try to provide some assistance. But I hope I didn't take too long. My intention was to pose some questions to what otherwise sometimes look like only a very rosy picture. I think that the digital world and the digital economy is a great opportunity for development and for the world. It's transformative in very positive ways, but we need to purposefully address these governance challenges that we have. Thank you very much.